We will now begin with the panel discussion titled Traditional Roles of Class Cities. The panel discussion will be chaired by Ambassador Nirupama, former Foreign Secretary of India. The first speaker of the panel is Dr. Gyanesh Kudesia, Associate Professor, South Asian Studies Program, National University of Singapore, who will be speaking on engendering diplomacy, Claire and Walter Crocker in New Delhi in Nehru's years. The second speaker is Ms. Nirupama Subramanian, Editor, Indian Express, who will be speaking on icons, ideas, ideologies, and inventions, media and foreign policy. The third speaker of this panel discussion is Ms. Ruhee Neog, Director, Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, New Delhi, who will speak on gender and security. The final speaker of this panel discussion is Dr. Rajeshwari Rajagopalan, Distinguished Fellow and Head of the Nuclear and Space Policy Initiative Glass Ceilings. This will be followed by a discussion and a brief Q&A session. I take this opportunity to mention some house rules. All panelists and speakers are requested to mute themselves when they are not speaking. Questions will be taken during Q&A session. Panelists can ask questions by the raise hand option. Questions can also be asked by the registered attendees live by typing through the chat box, which will be visible to the panelists. Questions may be kept brief and to the point. In case you're facing connectivity issues, you may switch off your camera and continue on the audio mode. I will now request Ambassador Rao to kindly conduct the proceedings. Ma'am.
Thank you, Ankita, and thank you to Ambassador Raghavan and the ICWA for giving me this opportunity to participate in this panel discussion with some very distinguished panelists. I hope all of you can hear me. The topic for our panel discussion this afternoon is traditional roles and glass ceilings. Now, the focus is, of course, on gender, a concept that we use in daily speech, in the grammar of daily life. Men, women, each holding up their section of the sky. In India, we have less women than men, which could get one started on a wholly different story, but we refer to the country as Mother India, in the feminine. As our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, said long ago, he saw India's soul as feminine. Let me quote his exact words. I begin. India has always seemed to me to have broadly more the feminine qualities than the masculine. Of course, the masculine qualities are there and have played an important part in her history. Nevertheless, the feminine qualities seem to me to predominate. Essentially, she, India, is gentle and peaceful, even though on occasions she may indulge in brutal and callous behavior. That is why I think that Indian women from whatever part of the country represent the essence of India more perhaps than the men, unquote. It has been said that for democracy to thrive without women is impossible, that it would be imperfect and incomplete without women. Those were Madeleine Albright's words. She also famously said that women's issues are the hardest issues. There is no need for us to attribute softness to them, therefore. India's own history celebrates the lives of women who were wonderful exemplars of our nationhood. Glass ceilings were shattered many times over in their cases. Here at the ICWA, the Asian Relations Conference of 1947 was presided over by Sarojini Naidu, who spoke of freedom, fellowship, and equality, and announced that the long night of India is coming to an end. Remember, the night of darkness is over. There is the example of Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, the first ever woman in the world to be ambassador to the Soviet Union, the United States of America, the United Kingdom, and she was also president of the United Nations General Assembly, the first woman to hold that position. She was a combination of robustness of response, daintiness, it's true, and deftness, with the velocity of the wind, as they described her. And then there was Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, who historian Ramachandra Guha aptly calls the greatest Indian woman of the 20th century. In each of these women, the elements of feminism, nationalism, and internationalism combined with such balance and equilibrium that we could hold up each example to the world and say, this was a woman. The words that the novelist Raja Rao used to describe Kamala Devi can be applied to each of these women. They were, I quote, firmly Indian and therefore universal, unquote. Hansa Mehta, one of the founding mothers of our Constitution, persuaded Eleanor Roosevelt that Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights should read not as, I quote, all men are born free and equal, but, I quote again, all human beings are born free and equal, unquote, expressing disagreement thereby with Mrs. Roosevelt's assertion that the word men was generally accepted to mean all human beings. In the words of Geeta Sehgal, by ensuring that the wording of Article 1 of the Declaration read, I quote, all human beings are equal in dignity and rights, unquote, and arguing that if the word men was used, it would not be regarded as inclusive, but rather taken to exclude women, she became the key figure, Hansa, who ensured gender equality in the document. It was a perspective honed during the freedom struggle when India's new generation of women spoke of not turning women into imitations of men, but insisting on equal status and opportunity, and who said, we would like to displace the picture so deeply impressed upon the racial imagination of man striding forward to conquer new worlds, woman following wearily behind with a baby in her arms. The picture which we now envisage is that of man and woman, comrades of the road, going forward together, the child joyously shared by both. Such a reality, we feel, cannot but raise the manhood and womanhood of any nation. Comrades of the road, man and woman, it is a compelling image. Similarly, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay saw her calling as public service, not public office, and as a voice for peace. The inner core of this fascinating woman is also revealed by her worldview, speaking in the 1940s, well before the enunciation of independent India's foreign policy. She drew attention to the fact that India's peninsular outline had widened into the global, with an increasing awareness that we and the rest of the world are part of a single sphere, that our destinies are inevitably linked, our paths interlocked. India is more than a test, it is a symbol. It is the mirror in which the world sees the shape of things to be. It is towards a world which recognizes the right of every nation to determine and rule its own destiny, but in a cooperative world order. I emphasize that the women of India and of the world have to strive for if humanity is ever to enjoy decency, peace, and happiness. Mrs. Pandit herself was told that an ambassador's job is not for a woman. But this little lady, as the Indian press called her, could hold the scene in Russia even if Napoleon and Hitler got lost on the steps. When she became India's first woman ambassador to the US, she was asked by a woman journalist on arrival, "Tell me, Mrs. Pandit, how does it feel to be world feminist #1? And Mrs. Pandit says, "I am not a feminist. As far as I can see, the question of being male or female has nothing to do with the duty of both sexes to take their part in world affairs," unquote. Which would lead one to infer that diplomacy should, ideally speaking, be gender neutral, that it should not occupy itself with the she's and the he's. It is the art of getting peace to triumph over war and conflict, the consolidation of the middle way, I'd like to emphasize that, the skillful and quiet negotiation, the mastery of facts and the consolidation of knowledge, the alert and the observant mind, and adeptness of communication. It should eschew concepts of hierarchy and hegemonism. It should embrace diversity. As women, equality is what we aspire to and what we want. We need not be encased by definitions. But when I say diplomacy is meant to be gender neutral, I still see the need for it to be populated with issues that concern the well-being of humankind as a whole, of whom women are an indivisible component. When women are victims of war and social, political, and economic upheaval, when they are anchorless migrants cast upon a river of no return, left to fend for hapless children, when they are exploited in conflict and left agency-less, should we not hear more women's voices shaping agendas and outcomes so that more sense and sensibility prevails? Countries are not summarily wiped off the map in acts of hegemonic hubris and the whirlwind reaped under the perceived responsibility to protect. The question I ask is, can diplomacy organize itself more effectively so that outcomes take into account the interests of these largely silent multitudes that comprise women? Can women acquire agency and make themselves more effectively heard? One factor that is often remarked upon is that those women who make it to the top echelons of diplomatic life seem to have no option but to adopt approaches that differ little from their male colleagues. Is diplomacy then a straitjacket, restrictive, offering little scope for the articulation of the female voice? How often is that voice heard across the climate-controlled portals of international affairs? It seems to me that too few women are seen in that world, and even those that are there are few and far between, to be celebrated, no doubt, but not wrestlers in the amphitheater. The glass ceiling is not so easily shattered. It's often argued that strength lies in numbers, and this is especially so if women's voices are to be heard, and so that the content of discussion on important global issues reflects the values and the new content that women bring to the table. But the numbers of women in such discussions are not growing exponentially. I'm not talking of the present context. They are mostly conspicuous by their absence in panel or manel discussions, and often overlooked when it comes to such participation, since the male experts are the default choice. The contributions of women are mostly overlooked or sidelined. We are yet to find a way in which we create that ideal blend of yin and yang in the universe of diplomacy. The problem of a not insignificant number of chauvinistic men in the workplace is also a global problem. What do women need most, regardless of what their field of professional choice is? I believe it is voice, that which enables them to articulate their cause, their interests, their aspirations. And voice needs amplification, the amplification that comes from numbers, from adequate representation. For if women constitute 50% of the population, it is obvious that their representation in professions and in leadership positions should be equal to, or at least close to equal, that of men who are similarly placed. Now, in the Indian Foreign Service, the numbers of women are going up steadily, but nowhere even near half of the numbers of male diplomatic officers. Out of a total service strength of IFS officers of 815 today, there are 176 women officers. 19 of these women are presently heads of mission, that is ambassadors or high commissioners. The numbers are still small as a proportion of the overall strength of the service and as a proportion of senior leadership positions. Then let me speak of the third aspect. The third aspect, after voice and amplification, relates to service conditions. In my own lifetime, I was witness to the long march we women have undertaken from what one legal luminary called the stain of sex determination, where married women diplomats could not continue to work, where you could not apply to join the Indian Foreign Service if you were married, and where you could scarcely aspire to the top positions of responsibility in the service. These were all egregious, grossly discriminatory requirements, a virtual apartheid policy practiced against a particular gender. The third barrier was the last to fall, and it took a famous case launched in the late 1970s by C.B. Muthamma, India's first career woman diplomat, where she took the senior leadership of the Ministry of External Affairs to the Supreme Court to protest against their refusal to appoint her to the post of Secretary to the Government of India. It was another matter that the establishment blinked first. They promoted Muthamma to the post of Secretary before the case came up for judgment, although while closing the case, the concerned judge, the late Justice Krishna Iyer, said he was dismissing the petition, but not the problem. The problem being that relating to sex discrimination in service conditions. Of course, the situation is vastly improved for women in the IFS today, but much is owed to the courage and determination of pioneers like Ambassador Muthamma. The question, however, still remains whether women bring a crucial feminine-oriented perspective to the conduct of public policy. When placed in situations where the woman is isolated among a cabinet, the question of being solely led by a womanly perspective does not easily exercises her judgment as the need of the hour dictates, and perhaps she is at pains to demonstrate that she is no less equal to men in taking masculine decisions. Iron Lady is another masculine term for women in power. No less than a man is what is implied. The issue would be different if the numbers of women in public policy decision making were to substantially increase and if women are no longer in a minority. That becomes the inflection point for greater confidence and assertiveness in speaking out or leaning in a manner that is incorporative of concerns about the impact of decisions taken on gender equity, post-conflict scenarios, violence against women and children, sexual trafficking, conflict and migration, and human displacement. But until the numbers of women increase, the preponderant behavior will be to conform to prescribed codes and methods that are seen as best practices in decision-making paradigms long established in a world led by men. And the scenario will not change so easily despite the best intentions to effect change. To cite an example, 2 decades after the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, which speaks to the necessity, for instance, of including women in peace agreements, 95% of military peacekeepers are still men, and only 10% of police officers and 4% of peacekeeping soldiers within the UN peacekeeping operations globally are women. But reverting to diplomacy, the problem may not go away with just increasing numbers. Most top diplomatic positions in the world are male. As a recent study pointed out, crucially, we have still very little knowledge of where women and men are positioned and located in diplomacy. When we compare and look at senior negotiation positions, the number of women is even lower. As an often quoted study from UN Women from 2012 reveals that women only constitute 9% of all negotiators, 2.5% of chief mediators, and 4% of signatories. And yet another study has noted, and I quote, centrally located male networks may shape recruitment and career development. Perhaps senior men are more likely to see, encourage, and involve men as junior colleagues. making it easier for junior men than women to feel supported and encouraged to take steps to advance the career. Also, the issue of overt or subtle signaling to women that they are not suitable for diplomacy needs to be analyzed further. Such signaling can have various grounds. There may be fear that women cannot network effectively in male-dominated environments, fear that women cannot combine a demanding diplomatic career with marriage and parenthood, reluctance to place women in violent contexts, or ideas about women's inability to control their emotions or keep secrets, unquote. And it is also obvious that Hobbesian values of war and security prevail. It is as if, as one scholar said, Aristotle's views on women as non-developed males persist. And diplomacy is still conceptualized as male-ordained, and patriarchy is not extinct. Nowhere is male patriarchy more in play than in the universe of social media. The trend is to overwhelm any point of view, mainly female, that does not conform to the stipulated common denominator of what constitutes the truth. Female opinions are subject to constant mansplaining by Twitter handles that are anonymous and ignorant. But social media, by way of its expansiveness and universal outreach, requires to be the arena where female views and feminist opinions must be freely propagated and accommodated so that they take root and refuse to be dismissed by the trolls or alternative newsmakers. Social media offers the scope of advocacy and the creation of agency. Advocacy because it promotes the accumulation of viewpoints and awareness about women's issues and female participation in policymakers and legislative matters and enriches the debate. Agency because it promotes women's ownership of issues concerning their welfare and progress, their safety and well-being, their health and empowerment, and their rights to be agents of peace and security. We the people must include she the people. Social media provides that sounding board, that listening platform that increases engagement between civil society activists who want the empowerment of women. It enables their voices to be heard and to be introduced into the policy debate. I was recently struck by what an Afghan woman had to say about the future of her country. We are not responsible for the destruction, she said, but we should be responsible for the reconstruction. For us who balance family and career as working women, it is natural that such concerns should be a matter of instinct. We would look at the drivers of conflict, try to understand them, not in an idealistic way, but beyond neo-realist interpretations of a given situation. Building trust, building empathy, incorporating gender-related concerns into a solution. But for this to be realized, women should be enabled to exert influence at the negotiating table in the decisions that are taken. A recent explanation of a feminist foreign policy included, within its definition, political dialogue for conflict resolution, diplomacy and trade, a stress on safety and well-being, especially important during COVID-19 times, building empathetic communities of states, a stress on multilateralism, when it's becoming very unfashionable to stress that, based on trust and transparency and shared responsibility, inclusion, and intersectionality, which takes into account the experience of civil society and local communities. There's a lot of connecting the dots and mapping the terrain that remains to be done, but the journey has begun. This is not about men versus women. Feminists can come from both genders, and I see men on our panel here today. The important matter is that we recognize and respect gender equality, the right for women to be heard, and to make decisions that affect peace and security for our homeland, to promote women's participation in public life, and to expand their leadership opportunities. There's no time for mansplaining. Women are meant to excel. Foreign policy is meant to be inclusivist. Diplomacy cannot be a male-powered concept alone. And as the American politician Ann Richards said famously, I quote, Ginger Rogers did everything that Fred Astaire did. She just did it backwards and in high heels, unquote. Thank you so much. I'll stop here and we can now start our panel discussion. I'd like to introduce the first of our panel of distinguished speakers, somebody whose work I admire very much, Dr. Gyanesh Kudesia. He's Associate Professor, South Asian Studies Program in the National University of Singapore. He's a historian whose main research focuses on the contemporary history of India. His book, A Republic in the Making, India in the 1950s, I especially enjoyed reading it. Another book is The Aftermath of Partition in South Asia. He was educated at JNU and was a Commonwealth Scholar at the University of Cambridge, from where he obtained his PhD. And he's going to speak to us on a fascinating topic, engendering diplomacy, Claire and Walter Crocker in New Delhi in the Nehru years. The floor is yours, Gyanesh. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible now.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. I'm very grateful to Dr. Ambassador Raghavan for this invitation to join this wonderful workshop. I'm also very thankful to Ambassador Nirupama Rao for chairing the session. I have enjoyed some of your writings on this theme, and I'm very happy to be part of this. And to Dr. Datta, Ankita Datta and her team for so helpfully organizing this workshop. The ICWA is an institution I greatly admire. The founders, Sir Tej Bahadur Sapru and Dr. Hridayanath Kunjuru, they are, icons of non-partisan, far-sighted, visionary public service. And Sapru House has been part of my personal geography when I was growing up in Delhi. So I'm very happy to be connected to this event. Now let me explain to you the title. Allow me to please share my screen, and I have a small PowerPoint here. Okay, so let me say something about the title itself. So this my presentation is really about two diplomats, rather one diplomat and his wonderful spouse, Walter Crocker, who was the Australian High Commissioner in Delhi in the 1950s.
Dr. Kudesia, a minute.
Yes.
Your slides have not opened. The presentation has not come up.
Okay, let me try again.
Just stop screen first and then reopen the PowerPoint and then.
Okay.
Now you reopen your PPT and then do this share screen.
So I have now reopened my screen. I'm in the application, and I'm now. No. Sorry, what should I do? Should I close the PowerPoint
and then PPT first, sir?
Okay, I've closed it.
Okay, reopen the PPT and minimize it.
I'm sorry, I'm more used to Zoom.
Once you've minimized the PPT, then you go to your screen share option.
Okay.
There you'll see your PPT's name, so you just have to double click on it.
Okay, I minimized it. Now I'm back into the...
Go to the share screen.
Here.
You'll see the name of your PPT there. Just double click on that. If you could email it to me and we can do it from here, if that would be an option.
You have to unmute yourself.
So if it is possible, can you just give your presentation without without the PPT? So you have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me, Ankita?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
In case you
I've
can't get
unmuted
the,
my...
maybe he should continue with this.
Yes, ma'am. I have
Yes,
suggested.
I have, Ankita, I have emailed it to you. You could launch it when you get it. And I'm beginning to speak anyway. So this is really about the Crocker, Walter Crocker, who was the Australian High Commissioner in Delhi in two spells in the 1950s, between 1952 and 1955, and then subsequently between 1958 and 1961. So he was, so it's about his life and his wife, Claire, who was, there as a diplomatic spouse. So it's really about, my presentation is really about that period, the 1950s, the Nehru years, about Delhi as a site for diplomacy. And let me begin by saying that, how I got into this rather accidentally, this theme. I'm not a scholar of feminism or gender, nor am I a scholar of diplomacy or international relations. My interests are really in contemporary history of India, in political history, in biography, in archival material, and in India of the 1950s. So this interest led me to write some years ago a short book called A Republic in the Making, India in the 1950s. And my interest in the Nehru years continue, in the long term. So one of the books which I really enjoyed reading about that period was Walter Crocker's biography of Nehru, published in 1966, which had a republication. And in fact, the writings of Ram Guha introduced me to drew my attention to that very important work. And then, of course, Ram, who is a colleague and a senior historian and in some ways a mentor to me, he also wrote a review of Crocker's wife, Claire's novel, which was published in 2001, which is called Peacock Dancing, which is set in New Delhi, and which is really about diplomatic life in the capital. So what really got me interested was this material, this very new perspective about the 1950s from Walter and his dispatches. So Walter, just a little biography about him. He was a compulsive diarist. He was a very keen observer of life, and he was a compulsive diarist. So every evening, of course, he would send very long dispatches to Canberra, in which he would describe the events, what was going on, the meetings he had, and so on. But he was also a diarist who would sit down every evening and write a very frank and candid account of his day, and very frank impressions about him. So I was able to access some of that material. And in this, the Crocker archives, which is based at the Adelaide University in South Australia, was immensely useful to me. And this was made possible by the generosity of Dr. Robert Crocker, the son of Walter and Claire Crocker. So in some ways, I have also been encouraged by the archival turn which the study of diplomacy and international relations has taken in recent years, with the writings of Srinath Raghavan, Rudra Chaudhary, younger scholars like Tanvi Madan and Pallavi Raghavan. So all this has in some ways led me into this project. Okay, can we see the PowerPoint at all? Can you move to aims?
We are trying, wait. We are trying.
Okay. So the aims of my presentation are really to focus on diplomatic spouse. I think Ambassador Rao mentioned, the role of women diplomats and how this has been a long march towards equality, towards breaking the glass ceiling. But my focus is somewhat unusual. I'm looking at diplomatic spouses and the role which they play, which is rather not captured in the literature. The literature is silent about the work, the agency, the efforts, the labor of diplomatic spouses. And I look at it from using the example of the Crockers as a case study. And I think the important concept which I want to put forward is the concept of sociability, which plays an important role in the diplomatic process, in diplomatic life. And then in some ways, this enables us to think about issues of patriarchy, gender, and family life. And in some ways, I think I also want to say that, often the diplomacy is studied at the apex level. So we look at diplomacy, we reconstruct the diplomatic process from the high vantage point at the apex by looking at the papers of heads of state, of foreign ministers. And in some ways, we don't really look at diplomacy from below. And I think, the dispatches of missions of diplomatic representatives convey a place-based perspective, which I think is important. And increasingly, I think if there is time, I can give you an example of how this was important in the relationship between India and Australia, if there is time later on. So I want to highlight this perspective of diplomacy from below, which is captured in the dispatches, in the writings. Ankita, could you please come to the slide 2, lit review? Yeah, the next slide, please. Yeah, slide number 3. Yeah, I think this we have covered. So can you go to slide number 4? Slide number 4. So I just want to, I've been engaging with the literature on gender and diplomacy, is particularly looking at the material which is rather sparse on diplomatic spouses. So the question that raises itself is the work of diplomatic spouses epiphenomenal to the high politics of diplomacy itself? That, there is, this is something, a phenomena which is there in terms of the contributions of diplomatic spouses, in terms of the work they do, but does it really have any effect in the process? Does it really have any agency or not? So this is one question. And I would like to reference here one or two works which I found useful. One is the work of Cynthia Enloe called Bananas, Beaches and Bases, Making Feminist Sense of International Politics. This is a rather older book, but it has had a revival recently and was recently published by the University of California Press about 5-6 years ago. So Cynthia Enloe makes the argument that women remain vital to, she's talking about diplomatic wives. Women remain vital to creating and maintaining trust between men in a hostile world. I quote, wives become partners in the symbolic projection of prestige, participation in formal, carefully choreographed public occasions, and fostering goodwill through networks of female sociability, involving the ladies of the diplomatic corps and philanthropic initiatives for the benefit of the host country. So there are some other works which I would like to reference, Helen McCarthy and James Southern, more recent works, and particularly I want to reference the concept of sociability. So sociability is a new concept in the context of diplomacy. It is really about informal diplomacy. It is about informal situations in which bonds of togetherness are promoted. So sociability fosters group identity, contributes to community maintenance. Sociability through informal conversation serves as an important channel for social learning and socialization among individuals. And then sociability generates social capital. It generates a backstage to social interaction that offers the opportunity to diffuse the friction of the front stage, where individuals expressly pursue the ulterior ends of their association. So these backstage openings serve to depersonalize contention and foster empathy. Further, institutions and rituals of sociability serve as a setting away from the etiquette of front stage performances and involve different audiences. So these are some of the takeaways from the literature which I have been engaging with, and really over summarizing here in the interest of time. Could we move on, please? Okay, so this is a rather nice picture, and this is a picture of Walter and his wife Crocker, Claire, and this is from 1958, and this shows them both together. Very few pictures which I found which show them together. This is them and their two children presenting the kangaroo to the Delhi Zoo in 1958. Okay, so at least you can put a face to the word. Okay, let me tell you something about them, their background. Yeah, next slide, please. So just tell you something about their background. So Walter was born in 1902. Both came from South Australia, from Adelaide. Walter came from a relatively modest background. His family and his education, his family was not really educated. They came from a farming and brewery background, which he was not very proud of. He worked hard to educate himself, supported his own education and through university, taking on blue-collar jobs, then did good and well enough to get a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford. It was very unusual for an Australian to go to the US for a master's after Oxford, but he did that, and then he joined the British Colonial Service, serving in Nigeria as a political officer, and then in Vienna at the ILO. During the war, he volunteered, and then he was in Bengal, and this is where, at the height of the Bengal famine, and came in contact with Lord Kesey, who was then the governor of Bengal, who was also an Australian serving in the British Raj, a very prominent figure who later became foreign minister through the much of the 50s and 60s, and later became the Governor General of Australia. After the war, Casey found himself in Australia. He joined the newly formed Australian National University in Canberra and was appointed the first professor of international relations in 1949. Now, coming to Claire, Claire was much younger. She was born almost 18 years younger to him, born in 1920, came from a relatively modest, from a relatively more respectable background with a family which was well educated. However, she decided not to pursue a university education and wanted independence and wanted to work. So she began working as a secretary at the university. There she met a young physicist whom she married, and they moved to the UK, where her husband was enrolled for a PhD. Unfortunately, so they spent the war years in the UK. Unfortunately, the husband died at a very young age, leaving her as a young widow with a young son. When this tragedy happened, she moved back to Canberra and took up a job as a secretary at the ANU to a professor who had been the supervisor of her late husband, Sir Mark Oliphant, a well-known physicist. There she met the young Walter, who had just joined the university as a professor. And then they met and then they married in 1951. Can you show the next slide, please? Okay, so in 1952, Walter, after having traveled to many places, was a little bored of Canberra, as can be expected. So he joined the Australian Foreign Service and was offered an appointment as the High Commissioner to India, which he took up in 1952. I'm skipping a lot. I'm not really sharing details about his impressions, his reception, and so on. And then, Claire joins in a few months later in September 1952. So they set up home, and home for them was, this is a very different Delhi. You don't have the Chanakya at that time. You have very little housing because Indians were not really allowed to build homes in Lachin's Delhi. And none of the diplomatic enclave existed. So there's very little diplomatic infrastructure. And they were lucky to find a home, which was 24 Firoz Shah Road. This is a place where, it was a two-storied bungalow, which was comfortable. And, this is exactly the place where later the House of Soviet Culture came to be established. That bungalow does not exist, but this is where it was. So you have a sense of the geography. The accounts which we have, which is about Claire's diary, and of course, Walter's diary, is about their domestic life and, their staff, how the children settled down. And then the embassy, which was really at that point in Connaught Place, the Australian embassy was in Connaught Place in what came to be known as a theatre communication building, which has since been demolished. And then diplomatic life in Delhi. So you get a very vivid picture of diplomatic life in Delhi. Next slide, please. Okay, this is one of the few pictures of Crocker arriving in Delhi, his reception, at which the main figure, who is very important, is the chief of protocol, I.S. Chopra. He was a very important figure in the 1950s, and he's really the one who is taking care of the diplomats who were arriving, helping them find accommodation, looking after their families. So a very key person. So this shows him being received at the airport by Mr. Chopra, and then the Pakistani first secretary is there, and the first secretary of the Australian High Commission there. Not a very good picture, but anyway, this is what we have. Next one. This shows him calling on the Prime Minister, Nehru. I have very vivid, entries about his meetings with Nehru. Crocker seemed to be obsessed with Nehru. He was through his years in Delhi, was almost writing, sort of, in a sense, covering Nehru, in some ways preparing himself for the future biography which he wrote. So he knew everything about Nehru, who Nehru socialized with, who he liked, who was close to him in the MEA, his daily routine, how he practiced the headstand, the yoga, what he ate, everything about Nehru. And of course, there are vivid impressions about who are the key people. Radhakrishnan, who was the vice president, Rajendra Prasad, and so on. Can we move on, please? Yeah. Okay, diplomatic cohort in the 1950s. So you have a very impressive cast of character in the 1950s here. You have, Sir Alex Clutterbuck, who was a British High Commissioner, who came from a family with a long lineage and a long connection to India. His father had been in the Indian Forest Service. In fact, there is a railway station called Clutterbuck Ganj near Bareilly, which even now exists. So here was somebody with 3 generations of connections to India. There was Chester Bowles, the American ambassador, who was very high profile, who had a career earlier as a publicist and as a communications expert, who had been a politician and who wrote the ambassador's report, who wrote several books about his work in India. There was Ascot Reed, a comparable figure to Crocker, because he himself had been a professor in Canada. He was a Canadian ambassador. He wrote a book later called Envoy to Nehru, a very sympathetic figure, a very radical figure as well in terms of his ideas. Malcolm Mcdonald, the British High Commissioner, son of Ramsay MacDonald, the former Prime Minister of Britain, born at 10 Downing Street, a bird watcher, a interesting figure in his own terms. Raja Ghaznafar Ali, the Pakistani ambassador, who had been an important figure in Delhi. He had been minister in the interim government of Nehru. And then a growing cohort of high-profile figures, of substantial diplomats from different parts of the world. So which really attests to the growing importance of Delhi as a center for diplomacy in the post-war era. So, increasingly Delhi making the claim as a center for diplomacy in Asia, moving from older places like Vienna and Paris, where diplomacy had been conducted, and particularly important in the context of the non-aligned movement. And this was a place where the diplomats from the different, the first word, the second word, and the third word could mingle freely and easily. So I don't have figures now, but you have, sorry, how much time do I have?
I just wanted to request you to if you can kindly speed up, because we have 3 more speakers and then we have discussion.
Okay. Next slide. Yeah. Next slide. Okay, so let me now focus on the diplomatic concert at work. So, the diary entries provide a very vivid account of Claire Crocker's work. And this is really about the very hectic social protocol of visits, of entertaining, both formal entertaining as well as informal tea parties. So a report by Crocker, which he sent to Menzies, the Australian Prime Minister in 1950, gave this figure of that between July and December, they served 1,000 meals at their residence. So this shows how hectic and the hospitality was, and how the scale of hospitality, building bridges with the local community, taking care of the Chancery staff and families, taking care of the Indian staff, and then, of course, the charity work which diplomatic wives were expected to do. So the wife at the head of mission carries a heavy load of protocol and social obligations. Receptions begin at 7:30, dinner at 8:30. Complaining about the Indian practice of late dinners, and then how the day doesn't end till midnight. Can we move on to the next slide? So, yeah. So gender and patriarchy, I just want to give a sense. So what Ambassador Rao said about Mrs. Pandit is, of course, very true. The very high profile presence which he had in the world of diplomacy globally. And then I think one also gets a vivid picture of Indira Gandhi as the official hostess, and much of the work which he did and of Nehru himself is really the enormous energy which hosting the diplomatic corps took. So you get a sense of that. And then the accounts of patriarchy that you see in the diplomatic cohort, in the MEA establishment, about individuals who who are there at that time, their attitude which comes through from some of the dispatches. Then, of course, Ambassador Rao mentioned the marriage ban, and then the famous case of Ambassador T.B. Muthamma. So I would not go into that, but I have got very telling quotations by, say, someone like K.P.S. Menon himself about the role of women in diplomacy. I don't have time, so I would rather skip that. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So this is another picture from that period. This again is the Crocker family at a zoo. Let me move on now. Next one. So, both husband and wife wrote 2 books, very different kind of literary enterprise. So, of course, Walter wrote Nehru, Contemporaries Estimate, which was published in 1966, shortly after Nehru's death. And this is a kind of a appraisal of Nehru, a very warm portrait of Nehru as the Prime Minister. And this is based on, he's writing in a very empathetic manner, both an insider and as an outsider. A very different book which Claire wrote. And this is about her life in India and in New Delhi as diplomatic space. So this is a novel called Peacock Dancing. This was published in 2001, just a year before she died. And this is a novel which is about a diplomatic family, a Anglo-Saxon family, where the young girl falls in love with a Muslim ADC, a prime minister of the president. And then it is really about the diplomatic circles and their relationships. In this novel, then Nehru appears. He's in and out, and there are many figures which you can recognize. So Nehru, Ram Guha wrote a review of this called Nehru in a Novel, which is an interesting review. Can we move to the next slide? Okay. Now, as I said, they spent 2 terms in Delhi. The second term ended in March 1962, and they moved to Belgium. Unfortunately, the marriage itself experienced a lot of strain, and marriage sort of really broke up. And I think the strain was really too much. The marriage, I have a lot of details about some of these. I'm not sure if it is appropriate to speak, but I've had unlimited archival access. I would not go into this, but just to share with you that the marriage broke up. It was not a friendly breakup. Walter was against the separation. Claire had to really literally leave Belgium and move to London without his knowledge. And then from London, she moved to Australia. The divorce took about 7 years to be finalized. And then in 1970, Claire took up a job as a house matron in a prestigious private school in Melbourne. And then she lived there with her family and died at the age of 70 in 2002. Walter had a career in Belgium, Netherlands, Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, Italy, retiring as the Australian ambassador in 1973. In 1973, he was appointed Lieutenant Governor of South Australia, which is a ceremonial constitutional position. He continued in that, and then he died in, I think, early 2000s sometime. Yeah. Next slide. Okay, so I think, what are the insights, if at all there are any? So one is really the focus on the diplomatic spouse, the soft power and sociability, which the effort and the labor of diplomatic spouses produces.
Yeah, Gyanesh, I think we really need to hurry up. We really need to.
Yeah, so this is my last slide.
Thank you.
So this is really, then of course we get a sense of the patriarchy which existed in that period. Third is the vivid sense one gets of New Delhi as a center for diplomacy in Asia. And then one gets insights about the huge effort which Nehru invested in this, as the foreign minister in the diplomatic arena. And of course, the enormous training, Mrs. Indira Gandhi had in her role as the hostess. So in some ways, working and watching, I think, in some ways prepared her for the future public role which she took up. The next two are really references, some of the references. Ankita, you may show it briefly. So these are some of the references which relate to this theme, and I will really stop here. I've just tried to give a sense of the story. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gyanesh. That was a fascinating insight into Delhi as a site for diplomacy in the 1950s and the contribution of the two Crockers. I think you introduced some very interesting concepts about sociability, informal diplomacy, backstage diplomacy. This is a new phrase. We often talk of back channel diplomacy, but backstage diplomacy sounds fascinating. And the question of fostering empathy. All in all, I think this is a subject that many of us, I'm sure, are drawn to and would like to understand and investigate further. So thank you so much for introducing the subject to us. And I'm sorry we had to cut you short, but I think because of the technical problems with your slide presentation, I think we lost some time. And but I hope there's an opportunity to listen to you again. Can we go now to the next speaker? This is Nirupama Subramanian, and she is going to speak on icons, ideas, ideologies, and policy. Nirupama is the editor of the Mumbai of the Indian Express. She was correspondent for the Hindu and prior to that of the Indian Express in Sri Lanka, and was also the Hindu's correspondent in Pakistan. She has extensive experience reporting on South Asia, and I'm sure we all look forward very much to her remarks. Nirupama, the floor is yours.
Muted. Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Yeah, hi. Can you hear me? Hello? I'm audible?
Yes.
No? Not audible?
You are. Yes, ma'am, you are.
Right. Okay. And you can see me, right? Yeah. Firstly, thank you, Ambassador Raghavan, ICWA, and Dr. Ankita for inviting me to this seminar. And it's a subject of great interest, gender and international relations. And people are constantly talking about it on social media. It always generates a number of lists about who's active in foreign policy issues, who are the women, top foreign policy experts, top correspondents, and so on. So it is of much interest. And I'm privileged to be part of this very distinguished panel. And I feel how gender intersects with the coverage of foreign policy and international relations in news organizations. I'll start with just giving a general background about this, about the kind of coverage that news organizations do. One is, of course, the foreign policy, international relations coverage from, the reportage on foreign policy and the politics of it, and which gives a bird's eye view of the country's foreign policy, usually from the perspective of the foreign policy makers. Usually it's centered in a country's capital, for instance, Delhi. And, the reporters in touch with the foreign policy makers, the MEA in India's case, and the strategic community and the like. The other kind is the reportage from foreign countries. So in this, a news organization usually sends out correspondents to other countries, to capitals that are seen as vital to the sending country's national interests. And I used to be part of this particular tribe. The best coverage, of course, is the kind that combines both the politics of it from the base country and how it plays out, how foreign policy plays out in other countries. So that is, in fact, the ideal combination, something that combines both. And let me just say right away that, because of financial pressures and the like, 90% of media houses everywhere across the world have wound up all their foreign bureaus. In this country, India, news organizations were never champions at having robust foreign bureaus. But all the same, major newspapers did have a sprinkling of reporters across, they had them in the major capitals as London, Washington, Tokyo at one stage. The Hindu had the most number of correspondents. The Hindu had a correspondent, if I recall right, in Dhaka, Kathmandu, Islamabad, Sri Lanka, Colombo, Tokyo, Singapore, Brussels, London, and Nairobi, I think, and Washington. So it was big, and that was the biggest. It used to be called the Hindu Foreign Service, actually, at one time. Of course, the Hindu also had to scale down all that, and now it has correspondence, perhaps it has correspondence in Colombo and in London and in Washington. So that's the extent of the scale down. And among international newspapers, the New York Times and the Washington Post are the biggest, have the biggest bureaus. So this is the scene basically as for foreign coverage right now. And as the title of my paper suggests, I want to look at the subject through three prisms. One is through the icons of international coverage, and that is because this is a gender. This is about gender. I would like to look at it through the prism of three or four women icons of international coverage, and then also raise the question: if women bring to foreign policy coverage something different than men do, and lastly, also the significant interventions or contributions by women covering foreign policy has been, and if at all they are seen as important by policymakers. So there's been, I think, this is very, very anecdotal. It's not, there isn't much theory in this, so it will be light in keeping with this last session of the seminar. So for my generation of journalists, from which I became a journalist in the 1980s. So I won't be far wrong if I said that the women icons in this field of foreign international coverage were all international journalists. There were no women foreign correspondents in India at that time, and there were foreign correspondents from foreign newspapers in India. There were foreign correspondents from foreign newspapers in other capitals. And of course, because the way the world order has been, the Western press was, first off the block in this, and I mean they still hold sway. And they had foreign bureaus in all the big countries and also the small ones, and they had, of course, because they had huge strategic interests abroad. There was a Cold War which was being fought across the world. There was a Middle East. There was Vietnam, the Korean War. It was and still remains a male-dominated field, even for foreign bureaus. But there were lots of women too, and some of those who leap to mind in my pick. One is Oriana Fallaci, the interviewer par excellence. She interviewed every world leader from Kissinger to the Shah of Iran, from Ayatollah Khomeini to Deng Xiaoping. In fact, her interview of Deng is supposed to be one of the best that was ever done, in which he really opened out to her. Then there was Kate Adie, who was just a night watch person at the BBC, and then there was a terror siege at the Iranian embassy in London, and suddenly she was called out. She was asked to report, and there she was in the thick of things, and she was just she was telling people what happened. Apparently, there was a World Snooker Championship that day, and I had to interrupt it to bring this live coverage of that terrorist siege. And from what I've read, it had a huge viewership. That thing had made her. It actually cemented her career, and from there she just grew and grew. And she was covering wars after that. She was in Tiananmen Square, and her coverage of Tiananmen Square is supposed to be a record for all time, actually. And then there was also Lise Doucette of the BBC, who covered Afghanistan and Pakistan from the time of Zia's death, the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, 1993, and so these, all these people, they had a touch of dashing. There was daredevilry in what these women were doing. I mean, if you read their profiles, they're all described as fearless. So, you had to have. It was almost as if you had to be courageous to step out of your own homes, your own country, and go somewhere else to these, places where full of uncertainty, war, conflict, and all the unknowns, and do your work, do it well, be well dressed, project yourself nicely on television. So they were a combination of all this. And of course, all of you must have heard about that incident where Oriana Fallaci, of course, throws off her chador in front of, as she was sitting in front of Khomeini and interviewing him. And, Lise Doucette has stories about following Stinger-carrying missile mujahideen from, for all across Afghanistan. They also never failed to ask the hard questions. So this was not just glamour. This was not just war and conflict and women in conflict situations, but they were doing real hard work. They were asking the hard questions, doing great stories from wherever they were posted. They were getting great space in their outlets. So in India, at that same time, women foreign correspondents were completely non-existent. It was mostly well-spoken gentlemen in the office who had reached a certain seniority, and they were posted to a few chosen capitals, London, Paris, because Hindu had some more of them. And until the 1990s, when communication was not that great, nothing more was expected of them than to actually sum up the headlines in the day's newspapers and send it across. And then the newspapers published what was in the New York Times, or what was in the Guardian, or what was in any of the local papers. And all this started changing as communication sort of improved. First the fax machine came, then there were computers, there was email. And in the 1980s, I remember, if I become a little personal now, I remember a colleague at the Indian Express traveling to Pakistan for the first elections that after Zia that brought Benazir to power. That was Anjali Puri, a highly competent journalist, excellent writer, brilliant writer. And she brought Pakistan alive in a way that had read before in any Indian paper. There were lots of correspondents, male correspondents in Pakistan at that time. Times had a correspondent, Hindustan Times had a correspondent. And she did just 5 or 6 pieces. It was just brilliant. I mean, it just, I thought, okay, this is something that I'd like to do at some point. Then there was, so she was one of the first to travel abroad and, bring back these from another country. Then there was the IPKF in Sri Lanka, and young women reporters, they jostled for space in those AN-32s that flew out of Bangalore to Trinco and Jaffna. There was Seema Sirohi, Seema Guha, who then later became the correspondent for the Times of India in Colombo. And of course, there was Anita Pratap, whose access to Prabhakaran was legendary, and that was she was what we all want to be some stage. The foreign ministry beat in Delhi, that was also male dominated at this time. So women had been covering hard news for long, but from the 1970s, I guess. But foreign policy, defense, security, finance, they were all male territory. And I think the changes, even in the late 80s, as becoming 1991 and the opening of India brought many changes to the country and the media industry, or at that time there were two or three channels, News Track, which was India Today's weekly news bulletin, and then there was Doordarshan. NDTV began in 1996. These were all big changes, and with the expansion of private television, the breeds began to open out to women. And I wouldn't say that it's all sort of great now, but there are a lot of women now covering foreign policy for television channels, for various television channels. In fact, I think when I look at their photos on Facebook, I think they're all women covering foreign policy now. Defense and security are still male preserved, but foreign policy, women journalists have made big inroads.
Nirupama, can I just intervene? Just request you to speed up so that we can
sure.
Go on to the next
it's not very long now. Yeah.
Thank you.
So foreign correspondentships were still rare. Women could write informally while they were abroad. They went with their spouse, or you were an NRI and you wrote from there. So coverage from this kind of countries, from the coverage of this kind was focused on Indians abroad, ironically well ahead and before the government was seized about NRIs as a pivot to these countries. So that's a little history. So let me move to the other question. Is foreign policy coverage by women different from that by men? Do they bring in perspectives that men do not? Do they bring in women's perspectives, feminist ideologies to global affairs? Are women covering climate change better than their counterparts? And if there aren't enough women in this elite male-dominated club of foreign correspondents, foreign policy correspondents, are the stories we read from the world not representative of one half of the world? So women carry this burden of their stereotype. They are supposed to be pacifist, compassionate. Ambassador Rao was just saying all this, empathetic. They build networks, multilateral networks, expected to. So but as women journalists, as a woman journalist who covered, who reported from 2 countries, did I do peace journalism? Are we peace activists? Do we think less in strategic foreign policy terms and think less with our head, more with our heart, in our preoccupation with what is finally our main job? To tell compelling stories about the lived experience of people, men, women, this is what we do. And what differences would such stories make to the overall framing of foreign policy back home? There's been this school of thought in international relations called Feminist international relations that talks about how peace, security, which are the cornerstones of foreign policy and global relations, they reek of masculinity. They do not reflect the lived experiences of women in any part of the world. And that this is why there are wars, destruction, all kinds of sort of counterproductive things. As journalists, as a journalist, I'm not trained in IR theory, and I don't think many of my colleagues in the same field are trained in IR theory. We have learned things on the fly. We gain a foreign policy vocabulary just because we are steeped in the stuff day in and day out. And the one thing I do know from foreign policy coverage, that even when it is by women, it is filled with male voices. There are studies that have shown, I mean, the proper scientific studies that have shown how many times a certain newspaper or a newspaper story quotes women on foreign policy. And to my mind, what is happening in Afghanistan today gives you the perfect example to study this whole intersection between the making of foreign policy, war, peace, women's rights, and media coverage. You know, I don't need a degree in international relations that women in Afghanistan are worried about losing their hard-won rights and freedoms in any power-sharing deal that the Taliban may work out or the Americans may impose on Afghanistan. Men and women have both been covering this process over the last 3 years, and not enough have written about women and their concerns in this time. So those who speak about women's rights have been pushed back also by those who want the matter settled. You know, let's finish off this first, then we'll come to women's rights. So the Pakistanis have said on occasions, "Ha, you know, sab theek ho jayega. Ye to itna koi bada masla nahi hai. You know, the Taliban are okay about all this. The Americans don't want to hear about it." And it is only as women press to become part of this negotiating process did their cause start getting some traction. So here's a process that is talking about peace, but does not reflect the concerns of women. Can, Ambassador raised this question as well, can a foreign policy that deliberately excludes women, that sets up an anti-women power structure, not just anti-women, but one that is openly violent towards women, can it hope that peace and security will then follow? So, you know, there are no easy answers to this, but I don't think women journalists covering Afghanistan who took up this issue, including myself, wrote about it as a feminist cause that had to be driven home in piece after piece that we wrote. In part because this is not the only problematic issue about that process. Men have been as worried as women. But, you know, leave aside the question of whether this was right or wrong. My point is that most women journalists do cover foreign affairs just like their male counterparts, whether in war or peace, at home or abroad. And I think that's as long as women as long as men are in charge for policy, this is going to be the case. And as regards and so this is the other thing is there such a thing as a women-centric foreign policy? Can there ever be something that is a women-centric foreign policy? If women are put in charge of making policy, would they make it less masculine? We had Lakshmi who was willing to fight the British to save her kingdom, and Indira Gandhi could dismember a neighbor in Indian national interest, plot an intervention in Sri Lanka at the height of the Cold War. So the stereotypes may not all be true. We had Sushma Swaraj as the foreign minister very recently, and she was known for her compassion to Indians stuck abroad in difficult situations, but that's not really foreign policy. And when it came to foreign policy, when it came to Pakistan, she was as loud as any man in wanting to avenge the deaths, eye for an eye, head for a head. So I don't know if the stereotypes are all, we work exactly according to those stereotypes. And lastly, I'm just rushing through all this. I think to an extent about the interventions, I think to an extent every reporter hopes to make a contribution in an intervention. We all want to be seen as opinion makers, but overall we deal with information, we deal with telling compelling stories. I mean, that is our stock in trade. And the foreign policy establishment that we may believe that we are trying to influence or whatever, sees foreign policy coverage as one of two things. That, you know, either it's too much information, it's out in the public sphere, it's not good for national interest. It opens it out to, to the people and who don't really understand the nuances, or they want to completely control the coverage. They want complete control of what goes out, and if you don't toe the line, then they can do things like blocking access, or they can blackball you, whatever. Those are some of the things one has experienced, and I can talk about this freely here in this panel. So I really don't know how much we influence, but I would like to think that in the way we do cover, we do make an impact, at least among readers, if not neighbors. I think we do give an understanding of what is going on in the world, which is important in terms of information, of being well informed. I also think that women for foreign policy, the women who cover foreign policy, especially the foreign correspondents, go out of their way to understand countries that they're posted in better. I have, from personal experience, I have seen men heading to the High Commission and the women heading out in the other direction to sort of meet people and keep in touch with with the people of that particular country and try and mine more stories from that. So just to give a broader understanding, for instance, recently we had Soumya Ashok in China, and she did some wonderful stories that the men would not do, and she would call me and say, look, all these guys here, they don't even call me for their lunches because they think that I'm just a lightweight. I just do these kind of flim-flam stories that don't have any place in foreign policy. So I thought that was interesting from their personal reflections. Mine, I think I broke a ceiling in a glass ceiling, in the sense that I was the first woman correspondent to be posted to Pakistan. And I'd just like to finish off with one line here about somebody, as I was leaving 4 years later, there was this gentleman called Asad Durrani, who's now famous as an author, and he's got into a lot of trouble back home. And I was telling him that, General Saab, I'm leaving, and I'd like you to keep in touch with my successor, and she's also coming. He said, another woman? Why are they sending women to Pakistan? What is going on here? Why are they sending single women to Pakistan? So I said, why do you think? So then he said, no, it's, this is all because I think there's also you do double time. You work as reporters, and then you also pass on a lot of information to your missions, all that. And I couldn't at that point, I was laughing because I couldn't tell him at that point that single women reporters are cheaper and less expensive. They don't have kids. You don't have to pay. The organization doesn't have to pay for their children's upkeep. They don't have to send those children to international schools. We come much cheaper. That is why they send single women journalists to countries abroad. Thanks.
Thank you, Nirupama, for that very enlightening and interesting perspective on women journalists. I loved your reference to the Hindu Foreign Service. Many trailblazing examples that you mentioned, defying stereotypes, telling compelling stories, and I quite understand that there's no easy answer to whether women can report differently from their male colleagues, but they certainly bring perspective. They certainly bring refreshing analysis. That's been my experience. And I thought, in addition to the names you mentioned, the name of Homai Vyarawala, who was India's first woman photojournalist, also deserves to be, her name deserves to be carved with pride, I think. Indian women journalists go. Thank you very much once again. I'd like to move now to our next panelist. She is Ruhee Neog, Director, Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. She is a security and foreign policy analyst who works on nuclear policy, and she's interested in the transformative potential of technologies and efforts to regulate their use. She is going to present on gender security. Ruhee, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for the introduction. And I'm very sorry that you're not able to see me. Hopefully, this will sharpen one's sensory perception as we close out the day. A quick round of thanks before I begin. I want to thank ICWA, Ambassador Dr. Raghavan, SAU, and Professor Chaturvedi for convening this important and really very thoughtfully conceptualized conference, and also for inviting me to share my thoughts. My thanks also to Ambassador Rao, Ms. Subramanian, Professor Kudesia. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I got the pronunciation right. And in advance to Dr. Pillai Rajagopalan for all your remarks. A final word of thanks also to Dr. Ankita Datta, who has very patiently facilitated my participation. I'm truly honored to be here alongside such remarkable men and women. Moving on to the content of my presentation, given the personalized nature of, or rather the framing of the title of this particular session, which is Traditional Roles and Glass Ceilings, my observations are going to be in large part quite experiential, much like Ms. Subramanian's. And again, like her, what I would like to do is to look at the topic of gender and security along three anchors that, in my view, would benefit or could benefit from a feminist line of inquiry. The first of these is the professional, which is the space that I inhabit as someone who studies security and foreign policy issues more broadly, but nuclear policy issues more specifically. The second anchor that I would like to speak on a little bit is on women in leadership roles. And for that, of course, I have to thank, the trailblazers that I'm sharing this panel with today, and the several women and men who spoke before me. Finally, the topic that I would like to speak on a little bit is organizational, which is in terms of the nature and scope of or composition of think tanks in India. And what I would like to clarify before I go any further is that my remarks are purely from a think tank perspective, which is where I have had most of my training and experience. To begin with the very first one, which is the professional anchor. And these are my observations as someone who works on security issues. Now, I find that this particular field of study itself is quite gendered. And by this, I mean that our cognitive conditioning in how to think about security issues presents a systemic challenge. And here, I think Dr. Rajeshwari Pillai Rajagopalan will attest to this having a knockdown impact on representation in terms of numbers. The nuclear field, particularly as it relates to weapons in India, still continues to have very few women. Now, this cognitive conditioning, drawing from my research and my anecdotal experience, I find operates at two different levels. And the first one has been spoken on quite extensively in preceding sessions, which is how we view security, whose lens, as we know, has traditionally been quite male-driven, quite exclusively male-driven. And also what we have here is security's association with masculinity. And if you could see me, you would see that I'm using air quotes around masculinity because when I refer to the word here, I'm talking about the expectations or the attributes that are associated with masculinity or how it is defined. And this connection between security and masculinity has led, among other things, within the field of security to the prioritization of a hard conceptualization of security. And Dr. Swarna Rajagopalan, in one of the earlier sessions, spoke on this very eloquently when she talked about how, the prominence that is given to security that centers on the state tends to subjugate security that focuses on the individual, which is human security. Now, this understanding of, the security field and how it operates is sustained quite critically through, the use of a certain kind of language, particularly technical jargon, And here you will find, as you would all of course know, within the national security domain, there is language that invokes a kind of alpha maleness. Yeah. One of the terms that I have encountered a few times in the past couple of years at conferences and in papers as well, actually, is counterforce cowboys. And I use quotes here again in the context of nuclear deterrence. And we know that this is really, microcosm of the literature on national security and nuclear issues particularly, which is rich with terminology like this. And I would say that, the use of language like this to me suggests a couple of things. One is, what does counterforce cowboys imply? That you may not be out there literally fighting the war, but you're as good as being on the front lines because of the work that you do. And we know that these spaces have, of course, traditionally been reserved for men. The other thing, and I speak here completely recognizing that I am also a scholar who appropriates this language, is a certain kind of intellectual elitism, which is, an overwhelming emphasis on technical jargon can also inadvertently be quite exclusionary. So, just coming to the second kind of cognitive conditioning within the field of security studies is really how we are socialized to understand the expectations of feminine and masculine norms or attributes, on which, again, several speakers before me have made some excellent points. We know that, feminine attributes quite typically are, especially the debilitating ones, are weakness, passivity, etc. And they're exclusively associated with women. And then you have masculine attributes such as, assertiveness, dominance, a certain ability to make quick and impactful decisions. That is, again, quite exclusively associated with men. Now, if you apply this to the national security field, then it leads to a certain kind of gendering along the same lines, which I think has an impact on, making people conform to a certain set of views. And to use Ambassador Rao's word here, it leads to a straitjacketing of the field of study broadly, but also the several subdomains that it contains. Now, we know that masculine subjects, they are centered on the state and they're seen as deriving primarily from military sources. And we have subjects like climate change and health, etc., that continue still to be called non-traditional security, that pivot on human security, and therefore often in terms of perception, they take on feminine connotation. And in my limited experience as compared to everyone on this panel, a career in security, or rather a career in the security studies field really, especially on hard security issues, by and large means navigating and conforming to this binary for both men and women, which then I would say prohibits creative thinking along a whole range of axes, whether it is policy solutions, just the recommendations that you make, the way you think about employment of nuclear weapons, etc. So this, in a gist, is are some of my thoughts on drawing from my professional experience as a security and foreign policy analyst. To move on to the second anchor, which is the question of women in leadership roles. And again, several remarks have been made, and I completely agree with this assessment that there are brilliant, remarkable women scholars within the wider security field in India, but there aren't as many who occupy leadership roles. And here I would suggest that systemic issues once again inform this category of analysis. Why I say this, again, I come to this topic from a very personal perspective, and I recognize my own privilege as a young person in a leadership position within the think tank space. And here you will notice that I don't use the word woman, and I do so deliberately because, thanks and I would say large part to the access that my privilege grants me, I have yet to encounter a professional situation where I have been shortchanged because of my sex. I don't have the benefit of the kind of insight that those who have been disadvantaged along these same lines on the basis of sex possess. I'm therefore not the right person to be speaking on it with any authority. And here I will recognize and thank those who came before me, like, the three experts I'm sharing the platform with today, for clearing the way for those like me. So really, in my own unique experience, the reservations that I have encountered then have, I would say, gender plays a secondary role here. They have primarily, in fact, been a function of reverse ageism, which is, to say that an assessment of work and skill has sometimes been secondary to perceptions of ability based on age. And I have certainly had an interesting time navigating, challenges in the course of my career. But I will say overall, regardless of the kind of bias, whether it is along the gender axis or the age axis, this has the potential, and it has, in fact, the demonstrated potential to invisibilize skill and expertise. And if we have these two axes meeting, gender and age, then I think, you find yourself at the bottom of the ladder. Now, why does this happen? What is at work here that tends to invisibilize women's expertise within the security field? And I may be completely wrong, but I think one, of course, is that the think tank space, even globally, is quite traditional still in terms of its makeup. And in Asia particularly, I would say this is reinforced by a cultural hierarchy that is based on age. And I have observed that this, in fact, informs how one is expected to conduct oneself. And it can definitely lead to a blurring of lines between at least, how you perceive respect and how you perceive obsequiousness. And this can definitely have a damaging impact on assessments of things like self-worth, credibility, professional identity, etc. So this really, at least in my own experience, is not always a man versus woman issue, as it is a systemic one. And by this here, I mean very specifically women in leadership roles. Completely acknowledging that there is a very visible dearth of women leaders within this field in India. And I would say that mentorship actually plays a crucial role. Just as a little bit of an anecdotal segue, my own mentors, one of whom was the co-founder of IPCS, I have always seen him as a maverick former occupant of officialdom. I'm not sure he would agree with this assessment if he were here. And the second mentor, an emeritus professor of theoretical physics, whose books, are collectively referred to as the Bible by Nobel Prize winners, but who continues to walk into conferences and say that he's there to learn from everyone else, and he really means it. These two individuals have shaped how I think about national security issues. They have also shaped my approach to leadership, particularly Mr. Patriarchy. And as you can tell, they have two things in common. They're both men, and they both very comfortably straddle different, often divergent points of view. And this I try to incorporate in my analysis as much as possible, so I do not, box myself into a particular school of thought at all times. To move on to the third anchor, and this particular, my last bit about privilege and leadership is a useful segue for the third anchor, which is, the organizational aspect and the composition of think tanks. So privilege and access becomes relevant here, as does the fact of think tanks still being quite niche, elite, and therefore, I would argue, an exclusionary spaces. Now, within the Indian context particularly, we encounter intellectual disenfranchisement of various kinds. And I would say that often these can go beyond gender or intersect with gender in very complex ways. So you have things like caste, class, the ability to speak English, regionalism, all of these together or even separately can result in keeping perfectly capable, brilliant people, whether men or women, outside of the narrative. And here the space that I refer to particularly are the think tanks working on foreign policy and strategic issues within the country. So then what this makes me do is to look at merit itself as a construction. We all make arguments for meritocracy as the best standard of measure, myself included. But if we were to see it as the result of access and resources, then merit itself becomes dubious. It can become a fallacy. And this, together with, I would say, particularly the third part, which is the organizational aspect and the composition of think tanks in India and hiring practices across the board, with my very personal professional experiences, as well as my thoughts on leadership together, I would say recommend quite strongly the application of a more intersectional approach in applying feminism to the security studies field. And I think it can reveal vulnerabilities of different kinds, even within our very small think tank community. So I would say that ultimately we must continue to find more space for women in the field, whether it is in terms of more visibility, legitimacy, or wider representation in leadership roles. But I think we also need to advocate for gender equality with some necessary caveats. And I think we should be mindful of not replacing across the board one kind of privilege with another kind of privilege. I will stop there. I'm very sorry if I overshot the time, Chair. Thank you very much.
You're still muted.
Thank you, Ruhee. Thank you for that very insightful presentation, expressed also very beautifully, I thought. And you covered various aspects of the connections between the female expression and the rights of women in the field, while at the same time, I think, representing it in a very nuanced fashion. I don't want to delay the ongoing process of this panel too much, so I will move now to the next speaker, who is Dr. Rajeshwari Rajagopalan, Distinguished Fellow and Head of the Nuclear and Space Program Initiative at the Observer Research Foundation in Delhi. She heads the nuclear, as I said, let me get this document up properly, Nuclear and Space Policy Initiative at the ORF. She has a very impressive CV, and if I read it out, we're going to delay things further. But she is going to speak on traditional roles and glass ceilings. The floor is yours, Raji.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Rao. And at the outset, let me thank the ICWA leadership, Dr. T.C. Raghavan, and certainly Ankita Datta for reaching out to me to be part of this conversation. I think this is one of the much needed contemporary policy conversations. So I'm particularly happy that you have taken up this subject for this two-day conference. To stick to the, to get to the point right away, I think the ideas of traditional roles differ from society to society. In some respect, I would say situation in India may be better. There in some areas, I'm not saying everywhere. I think I have put too many Twitter posts saying that no country women. So I think there are seriously a lot of different issues in many ways. But in some areas, I think we have been possibly better. For instance, we have not been told that you could not do engineering or medical and so on and so forth. So traditionally, I think women have fared well, at least in as much as possible, in the engineering and medicine and such other areas. Certainly better than if you were to compare the US, for instance, where there is still some hesitation in seeing women in the role of doctors, engineers, lawyers, and so on and so forth. But for whatever reason, this has not been as much the case in the case of India. But I think But I also want to make a larger point. Women have pursued their career only until they got married, for instance, or else it was decided for them by their family, their in-laws and their husbands, and whether they should work or not. So I think there are a lot of different issues before I come to the field of IR and security studies. Or there are other situations which again applies to IR and security studies as well, where men are in a transferable job and women just tag along wherever the man's job takes her, in a sense. And in most cases, they certainly have not pursued their career unless their family wanted her to do so. But even then, again, the primary role for the women, traditional role for the women have always been the well-being of the family, take care of the family, family responsibilities come first, and only after that the career had a place at all. And the somewhat related to this is the next issue of the employers investing in you. I think this has been not really talked about, but I think most employers won't look at you as somebody that they need to invest in because they look at you as somebody who's transitioning into a married life, follow the husband's career path and so on and so forth after a short period of time. So they have not really seen the utility, the need to invest in and nurture your expertise, especially essentially what I'm trying to say is that same patriarchal expectations, and therefore they haven't felt the need to invest and nurture the career, nurture the expertise in you, in a sense. But let me come to some of the few points as it pertains to the IR and security studies fields that most of us belong here in that sense. So most of the work that I do, again, is in the IR and security studies area, which have traditionally remained a male-dominated area. One has seen, of course, an increase in the number of women in IR and security studies as compared to 20 years ago. But I think when you look at the numbers at the higher levels, for instance, they certainly go down. They begin to dwindle in significant terms as one looks at the higher levels. The number of women leadership or in management roles within think tanks or government bureaucracies is still a small minority. This is also evident when you look at the number of women or the lack of it, for instance, in senior executive positions or in mentoring or supervisory roles in think tanks and academic circles. So while women do make a sizable number in think tanks and policy world in general, their upward mobility to senior and management positions continue to remain a serious issue. There are certainly a larger number of women graduating in IR and security studies today, as like I said, compared to 2 decades ago, but they certainly they are not making it to senior positions of any kind. And there can be several different reasons for this. The fact that women are not promoted in an equitable fashion could be a factor contributing to this imbalance that we see today. Considering all things equal, for the same job, a man and a woman are graded and judged very differently, and they do not enjoy the same perks and allowances. And other than government jobs, I think in most places there are huge disparities in terms of the pay and salaries, pay, other allowances, and so on and so forth, for the same job done by a man and a woman. I think these are the time taken for a woman to reach certain levels as compared to a man is significantly different. Women are also considered to be not capable of handling institutional leadership or managerial roles, therefore denying them even the opportunity to play a role and play that part at all. So I think there are serious issues in how I think previous speakers have talked about the stereotyping and boxing us into various categories and whether we're capable or not. Second reason possibly is that women and their work continue to be ignored. Their body work continue to be ignored. For instance, if you were to take the case of panel discussions, conferences, webinars, and these are other reasons as to why women do not enjoy the same upward mobility as men do. Manels and manfriends, for instance, ignore an entire body of work, and therefore their visibility of their work is also affected, which in turn goes on to impact upon the larger career dynamics, because unless people are familiar with your work, either through your publications, speaking at conferences, panels, and so on and so forth, your chances of getting your work picked up are going to be very low. So in a sense, it is a cyclical process. Citations have been, for instance, one important set of tools in undertaking professional evaluation, and fewer citations have come to mean that less good candidates available to be hired, to be promoted and supported in a sense. And I think there have been enough number of writings on this particular aspect as to, so why is that academics and think tankers in the field of IR and security studies have these kind of strong biases? I would quote a couple of things here. For instance, Professor David Lake, one of the well-known professors, scholars, former editor of the journal International Organization, and then the president of the International Studies Association in the US, said a couple of important things. He says he himself had a huge bias when it came to citation bias, and so on and so forth. He says it is next to impossible to read every single article or book that comes out, even if they are related to one's own specific research subject. He says at least this has been the case in his case. He's somewhat more inclined to read articles and books of people he knows, or at least he's personally acquainted with. He went on to say that for a book or an article to get onto one of my reference lists, I have usually had to absorb the work in some deep way, and this takes time. Personal connections lead to deeper readings, which lead to more citations, and likely more connections lead to deeper readings, which lead to more citations, likely. And this is his own quote in a speech a few years ago. And he himself, like I said, acknowledged that he was guilty of citation bias for many years in many publications. And citations on its own don't matter as much as to who and where it has been cited, leading to further popularization of one's own work. So how much of the women's body, that particular body of women's publications work contributes to this? I think the visibility and the high profile nature, I think that's a set of an issue. And this takes me to the next point. This also possibly leads to what is called the gendered personal networks. In fact, again, Professor Lake argued, for instance, saying that citation bias that exists today is possibly due to gendered personal networks, especially in fields such as political science, and by extension, I would say in IR and security studies as well. The gendered personal network factor may be even a bigger issue in subfields such as the IR, international relations and security studies, which are mostly, again, dominated by men. But there have been some changes, like Nirupama said, in the foreign policy coverage in the journalist world, as well as in the academia and think tank circuit. But when it comes to hard security issues, military, foreign, nuclear, space, and so on and so forth, I think this is still dominated by men in a sense. And it's I think, somewhat even more pronounced in the case of non-Western societies. It is particularly a steep climb for women coming from developing countries in Asia and other places. Again, among the women in Asia who move into security studies, but again, they have tended to focus on softer aspects of security, such as health security, trade, economy, and so on and so forth. So again, looking at hardcore international security issues, military, space, nuclear, and so on and so forth, I think this is still a very, very male-dominated area in a sense. And I think here, again, I would bring back the issue of employers investing in you as a resource, as an expertise that need to be nurtured. I think this is something that is again, the employers don't see you as somebody who's going to stick around for a long time. Okay, he or she is going to be here for a relatively short period. She's young, she's going to get married, and so on and so forth, or she's going to get married and move along with her husband. So they don't see you as somebody who's going to be worth investing in that sense and nurture your expertise in that sense. The other aspect is, of course, the issue of perks, salaries, allowances. Except for government jobs and kind of things, you do not have a standard sort of pay scale and so on and so forth. So again, you are going to be discriminated in those places as well. Central government jobs, or state government jobs, or where there's a strict pay scale, I think you are somewhat safe. But again, how many foreign secretaries have you had? How many women cabinet secretaries have you had so far? So in a sense, I think there are serious, you cannot take it for granted that, okay, we have central government pay scale systems in place, and therefore these, I think even now the equal pay, the need for equal pay is still a huge demand that's part of the narrative in a sense. So I think it's still going to be a long battle in that sense. There are no immediate solutions to this. There are gradual improvement taking place in this field, but I think we cannot expect rapid or dramatic changes, but we need to keep pushing. But I think something more encouraging that I see is that at least we are talking about these issues and I think that ICWA has taken the fact that you are doing this conference itself is an acknowledgement of the fact that these are issues that have become part of the public consciousness in some level. There are still a lot of issues when it comes to the number of manals one has seen during the lockdown itself. But I think we are seeing signs of improvement here and there. But I think this is something that we need to keep pushing, and it's going to be a long and hard battle to win in a sense. But I think let me close with a couple of, to me, of all the different challenges, I think a couple of them stand out as the most. One is absence of accessible role models at senior level positions. I think at mentoring roles and so on and so forth. I think that's an important aspect. Second is the stereotyping that IR and security fields are not suitable for women, and these are more better done by women, men, and so on and so forth. Again, that is not so much at the glass ceiling level, breaking the glass ceiling, but I think that's been more the case for people who want to enter the domain and sector and so on and so forth. But I think absence of women role models, such as senior level position in mentoring roles and so on and so forth, is one of the most critical lacunae that I see in this field. I think we are completely out of time. I'm going to stop here, and I'll be happy to hear your thoughts and any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Raji. And you've really outlined, I thought, the real-time challenges, the imbalances that women face in IR. The disparities in compensation, I thought, was a very important point, and the impact on career dynamics of bias or just not being taken seriously enough. I think every speaker here concluded that, but at least we are talking about these issues, which is very important, and I think ICWA deserves accolades for bringing this issue into such focus and enabling this kind of in-depth discussion. We have a few questions now since we've come to the end of the presentations by the panelists. There's one from Swati Parashar. I think it's addressed to Nirupama Subramanian. She enjoyed your presentation. And the question is, would more representation of women perhaps bring down some of the masculinist rhetoric, the jingoism and militarism in the media that we see these days? And what disadvantages do women have in this context? And of course, she's again brought up this issue of equal pay and moving on to higher positions. So would you like to take that, Nirupama, briefly? And we'll go to the next question.
In terms of equal pay, I think journalists, when they go, there is an issue, but I don't think it's as big as it is in other places. I mean, in the big newspapers, I don't think it's very stark. If you're at a certain seniority, I think there's a disparity between men and women. I think even at the junior levels, I should know this because I'm in charge of the Mumbai office. I hire people. I know what they're paid. So I don't think there's equal pay, and all that is not a big problem. Moving to higher positions is a problem. That's a problem everywhere. So I won't sort of single out just newspapers or anything for this. Regarding representation of women, Swati, do you mean representation of women by the media in their coverage, or do you mean more women in this field? I didn't really get that.
Yeah, I think I'll quickly jump. It was basically what Ambassador Rao mentioned, basically, but you said that it doesn't make there's no difference in reporting, which in principle I may agree with, but I'm just wondering if you just had more women still, and that's the case we are making out, it's still unequal. Would that make any difference at all? Don't you think with all this men shouting and the manners that we watch in the media, would some of that come down? I mean, it's more like
women shout as much. So
yes, exactly.
I don't think that's going to make a difference. But I do think in coverage itself, I did make that point that women, when they are covering foreign policy stories, I think they tend to be more sensitive to the subjects of their coverage. For instance, I will just give a personal example. having spent a lot of time in two countries in the neighborhood, I tend to look at India from abroad. I tend to look at India from the eyes of Pakistan. I tend to look at India from the eyes of Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka-sized countries. And I can get into their skin, I feel, and see how they are reacting to us in a sense. So I feel that I have a little insight into that. And yeah, as I said, my male colleagues in Sri Lanka, both in Sri Lanka and there was one in Pakistan, would all head to the High Commission, and you know, I would be heading in the other direction to see something or to see a play or you know, something like that. So there's a difference in the way we approach men and women, but we end up saying finally, Karaki, we end up saying the same things. I think we don't. We may have a few different kind of stories, but it's not dramatically different. And of course, we are all held, especially when you're abroad, you're held by the embassy to something called a national interest. And if you write from the bottom line, they're on your case immediately. I don't know. I mean, Ambassador Raghavan is here. Not that he and I had any bad relations in Pakistan, but I have faced this in Sri Lanka a bit. You know, so there is an issue, and I know other people have faced it in other places.
Thank you, Nirupama, and thank you for providing that very interesting insight of looking at India from outwards. I mean, looking at India from other countries and seeing how India looks from them. Something like the map that Himal magazine has, you know, of inverted map of the subcontinent with Sri Lanka and the peninsula to the north and the Himalayas to the south. The next question is from Dr. Nabila Sadiq. She has, it is Uma Purushothaman who has asked this. She says, interesting that ageism was brought up. I was wondering if any of the speakers have any thoughts on the intersectionality of caste and gender in Indian IR, given the fact that much of IR scholarship and foreign policy reporting and analyses in India remains access-based. Very interesting and thought-provoking question. I don't know which of you would like to take it, which of the speakers.
Can I give it a shot?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thanks. Thank you, Uma. And I think that's a great question. I think it's always, I think there are different barriers that have been around for a very long time when it comes to the whole debate or balance, bringing about balance and inclusion in our conferences, panels, in our ability to showcase our work and so on and so forth. And I think caste is one barrier that still prevails. So I think there are multiple barriers that we have to constantly battle. So gender is just one, caste is another one, age is another one, which again Ruhee also highlighted in her presentation. So I think these are constant barriers that we need to continually fight in that sense. You have been there in ORF, and ORF is one of the few places that had taken this battle very early on, even before it became really an issue in that sense, in terms of giving platform to younger people and gender and so on and so forth. But caste hasn't gained as much of a traction at this point of time. But I think in recent times, one has seen that, and I think this is gaining further momentum. And I would hope that we are able to bring more justice to every sort of inclusion in our panels and conversations and publications.
Thank you, Raji. I think that concept of justice with a capital J, I think that is so important. Dr. Nabila Sadiq does have a question, and she says, she's talked about the mentorship programs, training forums like you have in the US, the Emily list, and then you have feminist workshops like the one done by Alochana with women panchayats. More is needed, but what can be done to have more training or mentor programs for women in India? Since the concept of mentorship was brought up by Ruhee, would you like to take that, Ruhee?
Sure, ma'am. Thank you. I would say that this is actually an issue of capacity constraints. A lot depends on the ability and interest of grant-making organizations interest in funding projects like this. And typically, in any case, foreign policy and strategic affairs oriented think tanks tend not to invest too much time and energy, apart from perhaps a few stray workshops, on training, direct training, right? So, all of us, I imagine, whether independent or those with the government, all think tanks have workshops that focus on the capacity building of young scholars. At this time, I am not certain whether there is a dedicated platform that looks at the gender inclusion portfolio. But by and large, the problem here, in any case, most independent think tanks have a problem of limited resources. So there has to be interest going forward in assessing whether grant-making bodies have the interest and the capability to fund programs that look like this, and whether think tanks are willing to take on this cause to champion and have that sort of investment flowing in. Those would be my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruhee. And we have one final question. It's from Vibhuti Patel. It's a question for all panelists, but I thought our sole male panelist should answer this. Men in the profession get advantage of the old boys club. Don't you think women in the profession have to work all alone? I don't know if this is a googly, but would you like to take that on, Doctor? You'll have to unmute yourself. Please unmute.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
So I'm not sure if I'm the right person to answer, but I will at least try. So in the case of Crocker, Walter Crocker, he, belonged to that era, where he is very much part of this, the particular kind of socialization. So he was a Rhodes Scholar, went to Oxford, which itself is a very sort of male thing to do, being a Rhodes Scholar in that period, and then served in the British Army in Bengal, and had this kind of a colonial hangover. So he socialized, all the sort of Commonwealth ambassadors will hang around together. So the Canadian, the British, the New Zealand, and the Australians. So you find this, very similar kind of background. If you look at, this is what I was trying to highlight when I talked about the diplomatic cohort, that the people seem to be so similar. Escott Reed, Malcolm Mcdonald, Alex Clutterbuck, all of them seem to belong to this club. And in some ways, this in some ways makes things difficult. And there are very few women who are, in leadership positions. I think the Swedish ambassador in the late 50s was a woman, but that's about it, I think. So I think it does make, access a problem. And of course, the situation changes in the 60s and 70s, as Ambassador Rao mentioned. So in some ways, it's in terms of information sharing, in terms of access to information, it is a challenge. Of course, the women, high-profile spouses are there. So the Chester Bowles, his wife was quite prominent. Subsequently, the Galbraith, his wife, Catherine Galbraith, was very prominent in the scene in New Delhi. Yeah, perhaps that's all I'll say. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I guess women in the profession do have to work all alone, and it's a question of, where they're located in the system. And as more and more women have high-profile positions and positions of leadership and leading negotiating positions, I think the situation changes. I was just reading about how the United Kingdom now has women ambassadors today in 4 leading missions: Russia, China, the United States, and permanent representative to the United Nations. So that is, I think, quite a hat trick. I think we need more and more. We need to see more and more of that. Are there any further questions, Ankita, or shall we sum up?
No, ma'am. This is it.
Okay. Well, let me just sum up by thanking all our panelists for their brilliant expositions, very variegated, very finely textured, bringing out the complexity of the issues and raising very important, I think, points for attention about balance, about inclusion, the barriers that we need to resist, about the justice that is needed, providing the historical perspective, as Gyanesh did, and then the role of women in the media, gender and security, the international, the intersectional approach that we need, applying, feminism, or at least the rights of feminism to the security field, and providing a more expansive, more inclusive, more comprehensive definition of security, as when we talk about human security. But the question, as I mentioned in my remarks also, is to not to slot us into straitjacketed definitions or conceptualization, but providing more space, providing more context, providing the visibility and the voice that women need, which is really what gender equality is about. With the caveat, as one of our speakers mentioned, is that we are not into the business of replacing one set of experts with the other, or replacing one kind or one sex with the other. And I think, as the former Swedish foreign minister said recently, when you talk about female representation in foreign policy or in diplomacy or in international relations or security studies, it's about it's about rights, it's about representation, it's about resources. And all these three, I think, points were highlighted by our speakers, together with the very crucial importance of mentorship, which both men and women need. I don't think there are any exclusive needs in that context. But overall, I think as professionals, as people dedicated to what we do, I think the nurturing of expertise is of vital need for everybody, male or female. In essence, we hold up the sky together. So I think I'll stop here. I'd like to thank Ambassador Raghavan, and I'd like to thank Professor Chaturvedi for this wonderful confluence between ICWA and the South Asian University to speak about a subject that is of overarching importance that we need to reflect on. More important than speaking on, I think needing to reflect on, to introspect, to look a little inwards, and therefore to form the outward perspectives that we need. And thank you very much, Ankita. You've been most gracious and most helpful and most efficient. And to everybody who's present here, our panelists and the people listening in, watching in, our audience, thank you so much, and stay safe and well.
Thank you, Ambassador Rao, for chairing the session, and all the panelists for their wonderful presentations. With this, we come to an end of our two-day webinar. I think we can agree that over the past 2 days, we have had some amazing deliberations. So I take this opportunity to thank all our chairs, panelists, and our participants for their attention and their time that they've given us. I would like to also express my gratitude to our colleagues from South Asian University, Professor Sanjay Chaturvedi, Dr. Shamata Basu, Dr. Shweta Singh for their continued cooperation. I would also like to express thanks to DG ICWA, Dr. TCA Raghavan, DDG ICWA, Mr. Shaman Bakchi, JS ICWA, Ms. Nutan Kapoor Mahavar, and Director Research ICWA, Dr. Nivedita Ray, and our technical team for all their support. Thank you, and we look forward to having you all again for our upcoming events. Thank you.